Some call it Saudi Arabia's quagmire. 1,000 days ago, Riyadh put together an armed coalition to fight Houthi rebels who had taken over much of Yemen. But almost 3 years later, what has been achieved? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. For many, the war in Yemen has become a story of numbers. At least 10,000 people killed, 2 million displaced from their homes, and millions more on the brink of famine. Now, 1,000 days since the start of the conflict, Houthi rebels say they launched a ballistic missile targeting a royal palace in the Saudi capital, Riyadh. Arguably, their strongest display of defiance yet. The power struggle between the Houthis, a Shia rebel group, and President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi, who's backed by a Saudi-led coalition, has turned into a regional confrontation. And as always, it's civilians who are suffering the most. Nouran was walking out of her father's cement factory north of the capital, Sana'a, when the building was hit by an airstrike. The blast waves twisted her back. She's now struggling to walk. Doctors say her spine was damaged during the attack. While her life has been shattered by the conflict in her country, Nouran dreams of graduating and becoming doctor.
I used to go to school on foot. My life was beautiful because I could walk and write. Now I can't walk to school, I can only go with a wheelchair. I used to be able to sit in a chair at my desk and write, but now when I try to write, my hand hurts. I used to love writing, but now I can't even hold a pen.
But the conflict in Yemen shows no sign of abating. On Tuesday, the Houthis fired a ballistic missile towards the Saudi capital of Riyadh. They say they were targeting a meeting of senior officials at the Yemama royal palace. Saudi Arabia accuses Iran of supplying the Houthis with the missile. And as the conflict continues, there are fears of a wider regional confrontation. The Houthis, though, remain defiant.
We face a war carried out by 10 countries, and there are attempts to create more divisions and chaos, but that has failed, and we still lead the front against the aggressors.
Meanwhile, the fighting rages near the capital, Sana'a. Forces loyal to President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi are struggling to break Houthi defense lines. Civilians caught in the fighting are worried. Thousands of people have been killed since the start of the conflict in 2015.
My hope is that 2018 comes along with peace and end of aggression and blockade imposed on my country. But I also hope that all the parties come together and build a democratic state.
Millions of Yemenis struggle to find food and shelter. The country, which faces the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, is also politically divided. Efforts by the international community to negotiate a settlement suffered a setback earlier this month when the country's ousted leader, Abdullah Saleh, was killed by the Houthis in Sana'a. But for many Yemenis, like Nouran, who have suffered the most in this conflict, an end to the fighting can't come soon enough. Going into this war in early 2015, the Saudi-led coalition had a few objectives. One, to restore legitimacy in Sana'a by bringing the internationally recognized President Hadi back to power. Two, to militarily defeat the Houthis, who had been a prominent rebel group in Yemen for years. And three, to finally implement the federalism plan that was agreed upon by regional powers in 2014. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us in Kuwait City, Abdullah Shetty, Professor of Political Science at Kuwait University from Oxford in the UK. Helen Lackner from the London Middle East Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And in London, also Mohammed Jumayh, a writer, columnist and editor of Al-Quds newspaper. welcome to you all. Let me start by asking Dr. Abdullah Shetty this. We've seen an uptick in Houthi launch of ballistic missiles towards Saudi Arabia. For you, is this an indication of further escalation in this conflict?
Well, thank you, Hashem, and my greetings to my other panelists and the viewers. This was predictable. I mean, this war has been going on today for 1,000 days since the launching of Operation Decisive Storm back in 25th of March 2015. And it's a tough war. It's a difficult war because it's a war that has been engaged within the mentality and the environment of a Cold War atmosphere between two major rivals, Saudi Arabia-led GCC. Unfortunately, it's now more fragmented than it was when the war was launched. And on the other side, you have Iran, which has a very ambitious project to be the dominant power and the hegemon of the region, and using within this environment both proxy wars through the Houthis, Hashd al-Sha'bi, Hezbollah, and all the Iranian tools, the states and non-state actors that have been playing out in this in the region. On the other hand, you have also asymmetrical warfare for Iran and its proxies to be able to circumvent and to cover the huge gap between the armament of the GCC and Saudi Arabia, which is 10 times that of Iran and its proxies. So because of that, what happened, what took place, was a major escalation by Iran, not by the Houthis, to send messages, especially after the first missile that hit Riyadh back on the 4th, or that was downed in Riyadh back on the 4th of November of last month. And this is another message sent to the Saudis, to the Americans, after Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, displayed with what she said, irrefutable evidence that this missile was an Iranian-made and transferred to the Houthis.
The reason why I'm asking this, and let me go to Ms. Helen, is basically we're marking a grim milestone, which is basically 1,000 days since the start of the conflict in Yemen, that has had a massive impact on people and on the country on its own. Helen, we're seeing more confrontation. The Saudis accusing the Iranians of being involved, providing the Houthis of ballistic missiles. Are you concerned this is something that might go on forever in the region?
Well, I think, thank you for asking me. And I just would like to start by pointing out that although I accept some of the points of the previous speaker, i.e. that there is an involvement and then there is a Cold War element to the situation in Yemen. But really those are elements that have been superimposed on a very problematic internal Yemeni battle between, on the one hand, the Houthis and now everybody else, simply now that the Houthis have defeated or have killed Saleh last week, we are now in a situation where a lot of Saleh supporters are dispersed and have different positions. Basically, the war is a Yemeni war and a Yemeni problem in which the Saudi-led coalition initially joined in with the explicit intention of returning the transitional regime of President Hadi into power, something which is less and less frequently mentioned. Now, almost always the mention is that it is a Saudi-Iranian proxy war. There is very obviously and straightforwardly a Saudi involvement. The Iranian involvement is far more debatable, and I think personally, I think it certainly exists, but it's far less than is claimed. And I think the Cold War and the international aspects mentioned by the previous speaker are relevant, but they are not at the root of the problem. The root of the problem is in Yemen, in the problem issues between the numerous factions that are in Yemen.
Mr. Mohammed Jumeih, do you see any diplomatic way out of this crisis?
Well, there is a diplomatic way. There is a diplomatic solution if the intention there is and the willing there is to be diplomatic. We have the clear resolutions by the United Nations. We have the outcomes of the Yemeni dialogues, national dialogue, and we have the GCC's initiative. They are the three main pillars which could be referred to when we come to the political crisis. But unfortunately, until now, there are some conflict. There are some different interests between different countries, the super countries, the superpowers in the world, which doesn't look at the war and conflict in Yemen as important as it is in different areas in the world. That's why they don't try to solve it until this point of time. And I think from inside the country, the Houthis, after killing Mr. Saleh, their ally, the former president, they are trying to claim that they are the only representative of the Yemenis. And they are trying to send a strong message to the Saudis in order to put pressure on them so that they accept the Houthis as main player and main factor inside the country, so that they can negotiate the future in Yemen between the Saudis and the Houthis. And I think there is a different message which is meant to be very strong to the supporters, the Houthi supporters inside the country, especially after losing Bayhan. Bayhan is a very important area which they lost a few days ago, and it is on the ways where they smuggle weapons in Shabwa in the south of Yemen.
Yes, but Mohammed,
after that,
we've heard that narrative again and again about the Houthis losing ground, when the Houthis still control huge areas. Let's just start dissecting this whole problem, because sometimes people are lost when it comes to who is fighting who in Yemen. Dr. Abdullah Shetty, so there are the troops loyal to President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi, who is internationally recognized as president of Yemen. Then you have this alliance between the allies of the ousted President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was killed recently, and the Houthis, who control much of the northern part of the country. And then you have the Saudi-led coalition. Who's doing what here in Yemen?
Well, Yemen is a very complex situation. I mean, Yemen is wars within wars. You have the Houthis, who are now running the show in the capital and in the northern part of Yemen. You have also the Saleh faction that probably now will be rethinking the dynamics of after his assassination by the Houthis, who happen to be his enemies, then his allies, then his assassins. Then you have also, don't forget, the Al-Qaeda in the south and also Daesh mingling all over the place. And then you have the Iranians who will come in and to spoil everything. The speaker from Oxford stated, and I don't disagree with her, Ms. Lackner stated that it's not the root of the issue, but Iran always is the beneficial of all the blunders that the United States and the West have been committing, starting with the toppling of Saddam Hussein, and then the Iran nuclear program, and the flip-flopping in Syria, and not really taking a strong position
sorry to interrupt you there.
All of that has contributed to the mess that we are living now in, and including Yemen.
I'll tell you what's the problem with that argument in particular, among the Iranian involvement. If this is the case, why the Saudis and the UAE, who are key players in Yemen, playing a divisive role in the country, which is tilting the ground towards the Houthis and the Iranians, as you say? Because when you look at the map, the UAE...
there is also, if you allow me, Hashem, there is a mismanagement of this war. Clearly there is a mismanagement, there is miscalculation, and wars are not a picnic. I mean, whoever launches a war does not mean that he's able to end it according to his plans. Wars are messy business and are unpredictable in their outcomes. So Yemen is a classic case of that analogy, and because of that, we see now there is a rethinking outside the box by the important meeting that took place last Wednesday in Riyadh with the presence of the crown princes of Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, with the Islah leadership that has been shunned and have been labeled as a terrorist organization or group, and now there is a rethinking, and probably there would be new dynamics within the context of standing up to Iran and to the Houthi, especially the Islah party has stated clearly that their arch enemy are the Houthis and Iran. And because of that, there is a meeting of hearts at this stage, and probably we will see in the next phase of the ongoing saga in Yemen a major shift in alliances, and this could really lead to some kind of a solution. There is no military solution to the mayhem in Yemen. It's going to be a political one. But the problem has existed. There is mismanagement of the war. There is an exploitation by Iran of the situation. There is also a hands-off approach and also neglecting and a huge negligence by the Americans and by the P5 members of the United Security Council of not acting decisively in Yemen, not declaring the Houthis who are protecting the US Embassy and Western embassies in Sana'a as a terrorist organization, and not coming harsh enough on them and labeling them as terrorist organization and slapping them with sanctions with their supporters and with their allies.
Ms. Helen, you say that Yemen's biggest problem is basically failing this transition from an autocracy, a tribal old system, into a pluralistic democracy. Is this something that could be solved anytime soon?
Well, I think that's unlikely to be solved in a hurry, but I'd like to come back to some of the points that were made. And I think the first point is that, negotiations are not likely to happen as long as we have one side determined to stick to a position which is completely unrealistic. UN Resolution 2216, many people have been claiming that it's time that this one was revised and reviewed. And that is an absolute essential ingredient to changing the situation. I think the second point I want to make in relation to what people said is certainly the death of Ali Abdullah Saleh, and indeed the meetings last week with Islah and the Saudis and the Emiratis are certainly indications of very significant changes in alliances and in the direction of events within Yemen. But they are not fundamental changes in the sense that they are not going to put an end to the war. And we have a situation now where the Houthis feel that they are on a winning streak. I won't go back to the argument as to the degree of involvement of Iran. I think it's not, it's not sufficiently significant, but it is certainly, in my view, increasing. It's moving from having been almost totally insignificant to becoming increasingly significant. And I think the issue one has to look at, and particularly if you're looking in terms of the long-term politics, of internal politics, is, to what extent and how long can the Houthis maintain their upward trend? Because they think they are winning militarily. As far as they're concerned, they started in 2004 as some minor little group, and they've now defeated and killed Ali Abdullah Saleh. And, attacking Riyadh is just another sign of their feeling of superiority militarily. But I don't think that the political situation internally is similar, because their political support is extremely limited. And indeed, they are increasingly disliked by most people in the areas which they still control.
Mr. Mohammed Jumaih.
So I think that's an important point to be made.
Definitely. We will further explore this particular internal aspect. This is why I'm moving now to Mr. Mohammed Jumaih. Mr. Jumaih, the death of Ali Abdullah Saleh, many believe, would usher in the disintegration of the General Congress Party, which leaves Yemen with three main components, basically. The Sunni Islah Party, which is based mostly from Ta'iz all the way to the south, the Houthis who control now most of the northern part of the country, and the secessionists in the south of the country. Can these three groups negotiate a settlement in the future, or do you think that the divide is so huge that they won't be able to set aside their differences?
I think there are some shifts in the political map in Yemen after the death of Ali Abdullah Saleh. Firstly, the Saleh's parties will be divided into maybe three parties. One of them will join President Hadi's party, which is the same party, the section of Saleh's party who follows Mr. Hadi now. And the other party the other section will join the Houthis. And the third one will maybe follow Mr. Salih's son, who is now in Abu Dhabi, and there are some sort of negotiation between different leaders of this party to try to unite the party away from the legitimate president Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi and away from the Houthis. We have the Southern movement, we have Islah as well. So I think we have the Houthis.
Is there any way they can negotiate a settlement in the future?
They can, but the problem is the solution is not only in their hands, it's in the regional hands, and it's also in the international community hands.
So speaking now of the regional...
The problem is there is no willingness to implement the resolutions of the United Nations.
Okay, speaking of those resolutions, speaking of the regional and international influence, Dr. Abdullah Shetty, we're talking about a conflict that is claiming the lives of thousands of people, destroying entire neighborhoods in the country, forcing millions of people out of their villages. Why is it taking the international community so long to say enough is enough? This war should come to an end.
Well, it's the same old thing. That, I mean, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Syria, Raqqa, Mosul. Just today, to give you a very shocking figure, today AP investigation published a report that is really very damaging. It says between 9,000 and 11,000 people have been killed, civilians have been killed in Mosul to drive out the ISIS fighters there. I mean, not that much number, the number is not as much as that have been killed in Sana'a or in other major cities, but there is a humanitarian major mess in Yemen as a result. Even before, I mean, the war, Yemen was in a big mess, and it was one of the poorest Arab country, and it was probably the first capital in the world, Sana'a, to run out of water. And that was before 2011. So now Sana'a and other parts of the country, especially those parts that are controlled by the Houthis, are suffering immensely. And this war really has come to an end, but it will not come to an end if we belittle the role of the lack of engagement and seriousness by the international community. They are not really adhering or implementing or sanctioning those parties that are that are responsible for prolonging the war, and these are the Houthis. And just one last word for our colleague in Oxford. Belittling Iranian role is not really helpful. They are emboldening the Houthis.
We're running
they are supporting
out of time,
them.
and would like
they
to
are
move.
Funding them, sending them weapons. And I urge you, I will finish with this, I will urge you to read the report that was sent just a few days ago by Guterres, the United Nations Security, the United Nations General Secretary, to the Security Council, implicating Iran of supporting and sending missiles and weapons to the
than a
Houthis.
minute. And Ms. Helen, what can the UN, the US, and the international community do to stop this conflict?
I think the first thing they need to do is to review the UNSC 2216 and have a more balanced resolution which will allow dealing with all the parties that are involved in the war, and not just two parties, one of which is not very significant at the moment. I think the second thing they really need to do is to try and stop any arms going in, and that means that the West has to stop selling arms to the Saudis and the Emiratis. But the most important thing that needs to be done by the international community is to put an end to the blockade of food that is preventing food and fuel from coming and keeping the population alive. We're talking about 17 to 18 million people who don't know where their next meal is coming from.
Thank you.
We're talking about 7 million people since the beginning of the year who are on the brink, supposedly, of starvation. And this is not because humanitarian aid is not allowed in, it's because commercial food is not allowed in through Hodeidah port, which is the port that takes 80% of the needs of the country. And as the previous, sorry, just 1 second, as the previous speaker just said, you know, the majority of the population are in the area controlled by the Houthis. So if they are not going to be allowed to be dying of hunger, then food and fuel have to be allowed in to provide them with the basics for simple survival.
Thank you very much indeed. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you to Abdullah Shetty, Helen Lackner, and Mohammed Jumaih. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.